Well, I'm especially glad because of the last.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Susan Lang, and I'm your host for this wonderful Zoom event that I've been looking forward to. I mean, I'd much rather have Nancy in the store so we can all hang around afterwards and talk. But we're getting used to this, and at least we have each other. We have Nancy here. I just am excited to have her, and I'm letting people in as I talk. So uh, I think this is the right one. If anyone has any problem, I'm putting it on. I've just put it on speaker view. And when she starts, you can mute yourself and then unmute when it's the Q&A period. I'm sure there should be plenty of questions. Anyway, Nancy, as most of you know, has a PhD in linguistics, and she's retired from Prescott College, where she had, I've got to put my glasses on to write. My writing is bad. And well, here it is on this too. I can even hold up her book. She contributes to studies in the Salish linguistics in honor of M. Dale Kincaid, and she was founding of the Writing and Learning Commons at Prescott College, right down the street from us here in Arizona. I know a lot of you might not be in Arizona, but those of you who are, and I just love this book. It felt like a novel, even though it is meticulously researched, but you read right through it as if it were happening, and there's an antagonist and a protagonist. You know, this wonderful woman, Gladys Reichard, she had been, when I taught at Navajo College out there, I was very interested in the few things I could find in her because her approach was so different. And that's what one thing that Nancy's going to tell you, how that put her in conflict with the established anthropologists, and which were mainly male, at least at first. And I won't go any further because I know Nancy's going to tell you all about it. But I just couldn't stop reading this. I loved every minute. I went back over several places, and I'm looking forward to reading it again. And that is something I don't usually do because there's so many books out there, right? But this one is worth at least 2 reads, maybe more. All right, I'll shut up. We can all mute ourselves, and Nancy will take over until think of questions, write them down, because questions time is going to come up. All right.
Great. Thanks, Susan. That's wonderful. And thanks for doing this. We have really, this is really stretched out. I think I first approached you to do some kind of reading or something at Peregrine. Oh, last fall. The book came out, it was officially published in October of 2019. And then not long after that, being totally new at this because this is my first book, I thought, okay, I'm supposed to do something. I need to contact local bookstores and see if they'll have me, you know, and I'd never done anything like that before. So I reached out to Susan, who I really didn't know at all. But anyway, basically, we've been trying to do this today since about November of last year. So I'm glad it's here. I wish it were, you know, live and in person too, for all kinds of reasons. And I certainly wish it wasn't occurring on the first day of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's afterlife. And I'll come back to that. And so I clearly, you know, the first reason that the talk was canceled was because of the pandemic was blossoming all across the country and even in Arizona. And now today we have this day of mourning, which I think we probably have to do kind of unofficially because I sort of doubt that the powers that be are going to mourn this loss the way we might be doing here in Prescott on our own. But anyway, Ruth RBG died with her boots on. And Gladys Reichard died with her boots on. And I think that that just tells us that no matter what, we have to keep going. I mean, if we don't, there isn't an alternative, right? We must keep going. So I'm delighted to be able to talk about this woman that I met, through books, because she died the year before I was born. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about her, but mostly I want to use this time to talk about how we can keep doing projects like this. That is to say, we can keep making women forward history in whatever we write, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, speeches, journals, newspaper articles, whatever. Who was Gladys Reichard? One of her contemporaries, the anthropologist Ruth Underhill, who some of you might know, described her as a glorious person. I didn't get to that description until well into my research, but through reading her personal correspondence and everything she ever wrote over the course of several years, I discovered that, as a human being, she was sharp as a tack, generous, funny, outdoorsy, down to earth, self-reliant, intrepid, approachable, trustworthy, and indomitable. And I could go on with that. I spent a lot of time trying to come up with apt adjectives to describe Gladys Reichard, but ultimately the story, I tried to just show who she was through the story of her life. Today, I think we would say of her, in sort of common parlance, that she was really comfortable in her own skin. I also think we would probably realize that she was far more liberated than we like to think of ourselves today. I mean, there just seems to have been this sort of backward movement that Gladys Reichard managed to be, even though she was born into really tumultuous times, she managed to sort of get every last drop of the personal freedom that was available to her in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s and run with it. And I'm not so sure we aren't actually a little more limited today in our scope of action than she was. Her chosen field was ethnology. She, of course, did call herself an anthropologist, but the title of the book really came from pressure from my publisher to label her in a way that other scholars would, know who the heck she was, because she's not well known, even within anthropology. And so I didn't want to use the word anthropologist in the title, but that wasn't my choice. And hopefully the uncommon anthropologist conveys that there's something different here. Her professional resume is an embarrassment of riches. The founding member of Barnard College's anthropology department, which she also chaired for 32 years, Reichard became one of the best known, most prolific students of American Indian cultures and languages on the continent. She did extensive linguistic fieldwork in the Humboldt Bay area in Northern California and in Northern Idaho, but she spent more than 24 field seasons in the Southwest learning to speak Navajo and studying with Navajo weavers and chanters, who are also known as medicine men. I wrote this out, and I'm glad I did, given a bunch of things that happened this morning, but I will say you'll thank me later, because if I were ad-libbing this, I can talk about Gladys forever. So this helps me keep this to about a 20-minute spiel. From 1939 until her death in 1955, Reichard spent her summers in Flagstaff at the Museum of Northern Arizona, where she made the research center there her home away from Barnard. She spent her time in Flagstaff writing about Navajo religion and language, lecturing in MNA's vibrant summer seminar series, and drinking in the cool, clear mountain air she loved. She broke up her long spells at her portable typewriter by bombing around the Southwest backcountry in her latest Ford or Dodge, always convertibles, always with the top down when it wasn't monsooning. Carrying around her sister or friends, visiting archaeological sites, and looking for that perfect camping spot. Each of her 14 books, most of them on the Navajo, broke new ground in the disciplines she mastered: linguistics, folklore, ethno-art history, religious studies, and cultural anthropology. When she suffered a killing stroke in Flagstaff at the age of 62, she was considered one of the country's leading experts on Navajo ceremonialism, language, weaving, sand painting art, and mythopoetics. She was the only person, male or female, who was expert in all 5 areas at the same time. So to back up a little bit, Reichard was born in 1893, so born in the 19th century. She was born in a tiny but bustling little mining town in eastern Pennsylvania near the Delaware Gap. She lost her mother at the age of 8, and with her only sister Lillian, she was raised by her father, a country doctor, her grandmothers, and her father's second wife, who probably was the family's housekeeper immediately after her mother's death. She grew up in a big Queen Anne style house built in 1891. It's still there. I went to visit it in 2013 when I started in earnest to write this book. It's located just off the main street of her hometown, which is Bangor. I think they say Bangor, Pennsylvania, as opposed to Bangor, Maine. And the house looked like it'd been freshly restored. It was had a great paint job with all the gingerbread and all of that stuff. And it was a home to a tattoo parlor. After teaching in one-room schoolhouses and public schools for a few years, Reichard left home for Swarthmore College in 1915, intending to train to become a physician like her father. In the 4 years she spent studying classical languages and mathematics, she did odd jobs to pay her tuition. She was inducted into Phi Beta Kappa and the Mortarboard Society, and in her senior year, she was awarded the Lucretia Mott Fellowship for Graduate Study. Though Swarthmore was in most ways far from the social turmoil of the era, she was fully aware of the collateral damage done to the American social fabric by the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-19, sound familiar? World War I, and the dramatic uptick in KKK membership and the widespread racial violence that attended it. So one of the more exciting discoveries I made early on in my research was when I came across some archived documents that described when Reichard first walked out of the long shadow of anonymity that lay over all of her female family members before her and strode into what I think of as the blast furnace of American history. So I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from my book that describe that moment. I think I'm probably the first person to have trouble to do enough research to discover what those moments looked like. Excuse me. In her final semester, Reichard took a class from popular biology professor Spencer Trotter, MD. Trotter's lectures on human evolution were just what Reichard needed and at the right time. Repelled by might makes right's metaphysics by her life experience, she perked up as Trotter explained how a certain distinguished anthropologist of German origin, Franz Boas, had organized a systematic investigation of bodily form, languages, and customs in pursuit of an unsentimental, fact-based history of humankind. He spoke of the Columbia University professor's campaign to transform anthropology from a taxonomic enterprise aimed at ranking groups of people in a race-based hierarchy into a demonstration of his conviction that all peoples, regardless of race, creed, or sex, were equally destined for liberty. Boas, Trotter informed his rapt student, didn't rule out the possibility that further scientific findings might contradict his theory. The Columbia anthropologist's brilliance as a speaker and scientist lay in placing the burden of amassing empirical proof that all but white European men were primitive or inferior humans on those who legitimize bigotry under the aegis of evolutionary science. For every biological basis the socio-evolutionists used to mark whole peoples as different and unequal, Boas was prepared to conduct a systematic search for historical and cultural bases of difference that he predicted would confirm the essential unity of the human species. Perhaps most appealing to a young woman on the verge of self-definition was the breathtaking scope of anthropology in the Boasian mold. Boas's ambition to understand the fundamental traits of the human mind, to uncover the root causes of humanity's social problems, advertised a useful as well as noble career. The idea of man as his own guinea pig, the ideal of greater objectivity, The concept of the relativity of values all captivated Reichard as they would other earnest women of her generation. Boas's mode of thinking about the human condition revealed to Gladys that society suffered from ailments a medical doctor wasn't trained to treat. Biology is too much microscope and not enough life study, she said, before confiding in Trotter that a graduate program in anthropology was where she belonged. The biologist advised her, go to Franz Boas at Columbia and get the real thing. This isn't it. So she writes off to Franz Boas, and here she is. She's 26 years old because she didn't go to college until she was a little older. But she writes Boas, and he says, yeah, sure, come in the fall. He was not a stickler for, academic trappings. And he took anybody who was, he figured if they made it, they made it. If they didn't, they didn't. And so he invited her to come join the program in the fall. And he did wonder if she was just going to stick around for the 1 year's master's program or if she was more serious than that. And she assured him that she was planning to devote herself to professional anthropology. So having never taken an anthropology course before and having never met Franz Boas in person, she decided that she was going to become a professional anthropologist, period. So at graduation, senior women decked out in shapeless ankle-length frocks of embroidered lawn walked arm in arm with men tightly buttoned into their high-necked military uniforms. For many of the graduates who donned cap and gown for the class of 1919 picture, the festivities were a last gulp of ease before they joined a world gone mad with racial and ideological hatreds. So-called race riots, later shown to be instigated by angry white mobs, had not yet occurred in Scranton, Philadelphia, or Darby, Swarthmore's neighboring borough. It would be July before J. Edgar Hoover, an ambitious young attorney in the U.S. Justice Department, would fan the flames of Red Summer by reporting to the Attorney General falsely that the Chicago race riots were prompted by Negroes assaulting white women. Other officers of the federal government hadn't yet suggested to the public that Bolshevik agitators were prompting Black militants to assassinate their own leaders. The backdrop for Gladys's final hours as an undergraduate was the campaign by Italian-American anarchists to terrorize and kill wealthy industrialists and government officials with mail bombs. Rampant inflation, labor unrest, police brutality, job shortages, political fear-mongering, and gridlock. The war had laid bare too many of mankind's darkest secrets for Reichard to imagine that the urban violence that followed the war to end all wars would subside as summer temperatures rose. Reichard's decision to become an anthropologist was no accident, but neither could she predict where her choice might lead. So in that last sentence, which might seem like a non sequitur, I mean, I just told you that she made a conscious decision to become an anthropologist. I'm really shadowboxing with the men and women, authors, historians, and anthropologists who have created a written record that minimizes or completely erases Reichard from the historical record. It's hard to summarize, kind of how productive she was in all the technical ways, because she was a highly technical, analytical person. I mean, she did write some popular books, but most of her work was for an equally highly trained anthropological audience. And so that kind of stuff is, a lot of it's gone by the wayside. A lot of it's just, too technical to really get into, particularly in the linguistics area. But there was this, kind of total erasure of her contributions and her as a person that happened within just a few years. It began within a few years after her death, as I said, in 1955. And in mentioning that in the book there, that, in asserting that her decision to become an anthropologist was not an accident, I'm actually kind of pushing back against the late William Lyon. He's a professor Emeritus of History at Northern Arizona University. So, that's close by. And so this wasn't something that just took place in the East. This was something that was widespread nationally, and of course here in the Southwest, where people did know her, and she should have had a very kind of vibrant legacy. But Professor Lyon characterized Reichard's entry into anthropology as an accident, and in a paper he wrote about her in 1989, many years after her death. He had access to the archives at the Museum of Northern Arizona, where Reichard's papers are, just like I did. And but he got there first, obviously, and so he used that resource to write this article about her. I have to say, unfortunately, and may he rest in peace, but the fact of the matter is that his sketch of Reichard for the American Indian Quarterly falls well below the gold standard of serious historical research. This is a professor of history with a big reputation. I'm sure he wrote lots of other books and articles and deserved his status as emeritus professor, and I'm not questioning that. But this particular article, kind of stuck in my craw. Until my biography of Reichard appeared in 2019, there was no reason for other researchers to question the accuracy or the tone or the bias in Lyon's article about Reichard, or his motives for implying that Reichard was a difficult woman who should have known better than to stick her nose into the all-male arena of 1940s Navajo studies. So this was a kind of piece that I read in trying to find out what Reichard was like when she was alive. I obviously at the same time read reports about her from people who were writing anthropological historiography. And so this sort of mismatch between what I was finding in her correspondence and what I was reading in the secondary literature about her really motivated me to really get to the bottom of things. Lyon's biased portrait of Reichard provides lots of evidence of the subtle ways a writer can shape, or in this case, distort a woman's place in written history. We're probably all familiar with the statement, well-behaved women seldom make history. It began appearing on bumper stickers, t-shirts, and coffee mugs in the late 1970s, when it was turned out to be kind of a throwaway line in an article written in 1976 by historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, a Pulitzer Prize winner and recipient of a MacArthur Genius Grant. I discovered she's at Harvard still. Anyway, Ulrich went on to write a book of the same title, Well-Behaved Women Seldom Make History, because she felt that her one-liner had been taken out of context. And in 2007, she wrote a book of the same name. And what she says there is that what she meant to convey was that well-behaved women should make history, but that they usually don't. It was taken in the popular culture to mean that in order to make history as a woman, you had to act up and break rules, and smash things, that sort of thing, be disruptive and all those things. And not a lot of us are inclined to do that, follow that path. So it kind of narrowed the kind of person, the kind of woman who could actually make history. So she writes this book, and she uses it to encourage writers to redouble their efforts to write all kinds of women into our historical literature, both to improve its quality and its accuracy, but also to give women a national historical literature that they can see themselves in. Well, Reichard, glorious and as self-actualized as she was about as well-behaved a woman in her male-dominated field as she could be. She worked twice as hard for half the credit and for a fraction of the pay without complaint. She taught her entire career at a women's college, and therefore she never kept a man from a job he felt entitled to. She never had to compete in a job search. By personality, she was no mouse, but she was always courteous and cooperative towards her male colleagues, even when they were openly condescending and manipulative. She was lively and playful, but she didn't drink. She didn't leave a string of discarded lovers in her wake or engage in the cloak and dagger infighting that flourished in the Columbia Anthropology Department after Boaz retired in 1936. If she didn't make time to play the game of King of the Hill, trying to climb the ladder of success, that wasn't her thing. Then she did play by the rules that allowed her to excel as an anthropologist and fight the good fight for social equality. I think Ulrich would agree that Reichard's work should have earned her a prominent spot in the history of American letters, but somebody, or in this case, somebodies, acted to keep her out. When I was finishing the first draft of the book in the summer of 2016, you might remember there was an election coming up, the phrase vast right-wing conspiracy kept coming to mind. But of course, there was no political conspiracy to downplay or erase Reichard's contributions to American studies. She was a public intellectual and a writer, not a politician. Instead, by casting my net very widely as I did my research, I came to understand that Reichard was, in her afterlife, as I think of it, the victim of a deliberate, though not systematic, campaign to assassinate her character, and that facilitated her marginalization among today's practicing anthropologists. So these have repercussions down through the ages. The motives of her male and female critics range from professional jealousy to sexism to opportunistic gamesmanship. The methods used to write her out of history were just as various. A common tactic was to cast aspersions on Reichard's intellectual agency, as Lyon does when he depicts Reichard's entry into anthropology as an accident. He doesn't trouble to situate her accident in the context of the global social crisis that rendered her decision to pursue a career in anthropology as a conscious moral choice. That is, he minimizes her agency, her autonomy, from the first page of his article. And after that, she falls into this role, or he writes her into the role of what we call in linguistics the patient, as opposed to the actor versus the thing acted on, which is the patient, or the victim of her own poor or flawed judgment. Of course, this is written into the record as of 1989. And so anyone after that who wants to find out something about this woman, Gladys Reichard, who wrote these interesting things, but who was she? They find Lyon's article and they immediately see that not so hot. Something just, she wasn't anything special. Another popular way to disappear Reichard's legacy was to avoid mentioning or citing her in the anthropological literature. Reichard died so unexpectedly that she didn't have a chance to designate a literary executor. And her interests spanned so many technical fields, there was no one else who had command of all of them that could kind of summarize and direct her legacy after her death. Her contemporary rivals, among them the vain and imperious Margaret Mead, simply made minimal reference to Reichard in their memoirs, retrospectives, articles, book reviews, and textbooks. Subsequent generations of scholars encountered her work in libraries and on the web, but when they went looking for more information about her, the gaps they found in the secondary literature conveyed insignificance. It looked to postmodern readers like Reichard hadn't earned her way into history. Therefore, her contributions and ultimately her credibility were rendered suspect. I have to emphasize that I'm not an anthropologist, but sort of working in an allied field, and I had to learn a lot about anthropology myself, but I have to emphasize that I discovered that Reichard and her works didn't fall out of favor on their own merits because they were obsolete or substandard. Anthropology is a cumulative science, and there's always something to be learned from older materials that bear witness to past events and behaviors. Also, she wasn't excluded as a role model because she wasn't worthy of being emulated. In the 1980s and 90s, however, some prominent second-wave feminist scholars gave her mostly negative ratings by male scholars a cursory glance and decided she wasn't the hell-raising, bra-burning iconoclast that fit their brand. So here we are in 2020 in a, equally conflict-ridden and tumultuous times as those Gladys Reichard lived in. And the fact is, we need ahead-of-their-time women like Gladys Reichard in our national literature to push us into a more equal future. We can't wait for establishment historians, particularly the ones who are still writing great men-style history where it's all about, what this guy did and then what the next guy did, but the women are just kind of in the wings. We need to true our historical literature for all kinds of people. But in the case of women, I'd just like to say the work's not done yet. Maybe we think it is. Maybe we think we're in a sort of post-sexist era, and I think we all know we're not. But we can have an impact on that as writers and as readers, but certainly as writers, by aiming for a more woman-forward history than has been true for most of the time that people, men especially, have been writing history. So very quickly, I'll just say that if you're a nonfiction writer, writing historical fiction or book reviews or speeches or long-form journalism, anything where you do research to provide context for whatever argument or story you're telling, there's 4 things that you can do to make history. That is, to make history, to do history writing and think about history making in that sense, rather than the sense of somehow like grabbing the brass ring where you just luck your way into being remembered by male historians. The number one thing, or sorry, these aren't really in order. The first thing I have on my list is to cite women. So again, when you're writing, typically, unless it's poetry, maybe not so much, but most other kinds of writing, you're going to do some research. And so you're going to go to the research literature and find what contextual information you need. And what I'm asking people to think about doing is sort of going that extra step. If there's a standard history of a region or an era written by a man, seek one out written by a woman as well. There is one. They may not get cited as often, and you may not know the name of that person. But if you sort of set yourself the goal to just look that little step further, you're going to find there's a woman who's written probably about the same topic. The chances are that there will be stimulating differences, and you compare and contrast the way that the male author has written about a particular set of events versus a woman author. And it's in that contrast that you can get all kinds of original ideas for your piece you're writing, or maybe for your next book. Another thing we can all do, and we've heard this before, is to quote women more. Just quoting women all the time in the press and everything else, that by itself won't democratize mass media. But there's a couple of important things that quoting women, or making a point of quoting women in your writing, can do for us. One is that when you quote from women experts in your writing, you're helping to break down stereotypes about who gets to be authoritative, who gets to have a valuable opinion on any topic. When you're writing a book, and I mean, I'm reading one now, it's over 600 pages long, and there's an epigram in every little chapter. So the book is full of these epigraphs, and most of them are written by men. So I wonder, since the author is female, why didn't she reach for these pithy little epigrams written by women as much as she did by men? Is it the case that only men had the most interesting things to say about her topic? And I know that's not true. So when we're putting together a book or even a speech, and we want to use something persuasive that carries weight with our listener or our reader, reach for those women authors, or if you don't know who they are, start with one, and she will inevitably lead you to others. The third thing I have on my list here is basically watch your language. It's every serious writer's obligation to tell the truth, as I see it. But as we're crafting sentences with care for content and style, it's easy to miss old sexist patterns. And I'm not talking about, these guides to non-sexist language. I'm talking about patterns of word choice, grammar, and syntax. And actually, I'll also mention pragmatics. If we think of women as protagonists in their own stories, it helps to make them subjects of our sentences more often than the objects of the verbs we use. Passive voice has its stylistic uses, but check to see that it doesn't crop up more often in your drafts when a woman's involved. It can happen. It can happen to all of us. We've all been trained to write to the taste of the patriarchy. We also need to be aware of language pragmatics, and I can talk about this more later, but that is to say that language pragmatics is really the sort of the science of how we structure information. And it talks about things like topic versus comment, and this has to do with sentence level kinds of things as well. If we're going to be alert wordsmiths, we don't want to unwittingly shove women into the background in our public discourse at the sentence level, sort of one sentence at a time. Here's a pet peeve of mine, and I'm almost done. I got so familiar with Reichard, of course, I mean, sort of living with her for more than 3 years and closer to 6, that I tended to refer to her as Gladys. I mean, she was kind of a friend. But it's common in the older scholarly literature to see that women scholars are referred to in the formal literature by their first names, or Mrs. So-and-so, while their male colleagues are referred to strictly by their surname. And so it's kind of like, ask yourself, can you imagine referring to Franz Boas as Franz or Albert Einstein as Al? I mean, these are informal papers, right? This is, so here we are, as I mentioned earlier, we're on day 1 of Ruth Ginsburg's afterlife. And I'm really glad that this RBG thing started long ago, because, can you imagine if, Ruth Bader Ginsburg were to kind of go down in history as Ruth and the constantly reproducing that through the decades, we would lose, RBG in the process. But fortunately, she has the RBG moniker, and of course, we need to use it or some form of it so that she isn't lost in a mass of Ruths. As a corollary to this business of watch your language, I would say that quantity also matters. I had this experience recently, well, not so recently, about a year ago, of reading in a brief history of the Museum of Northern Arizona, written by a male author who's very prominently placed up there. He writes at the end of his sketch, he writes these little brief biological sketches of some of the museum's key figures. And in one case, he lists the woman's name, she has her own heading, and the first line of the entry identifies her as the wife of the guy before her, right? She's the wife. And the rest of her section, her little biographical sketch, is all about him. So she literally doesn't get a single word in her own entry about her or her accomplishments or her contributions. So we really, you want to look for that as a reader and call it out if you can. And then as a writer, you certainly don't want to reproduce that if you have the opportunity. And the last thing I would say is, in terms of writing women forward history, is cherchez la femme, right? So while there's no doubt that history writing or biography requires detective work, and a lot of it, and it's fascinating and fun for those of us who get hooked on it, but I don't mean look for the woman in the way it's meant in film noir studies. The only way we're going to normalize women within the historical picture frame is to assume that they are missing from most accounts of history's big or pivotal events in the existing literature. They were there. We know they were there. If the men were there, the women were there too. And not just as consorts or maids. I just read very recently, just in July, that Major John Wesley Powell, the one-armed ex-Civil War officer who led the expedition down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon in 1871, was often, not on this particular trip, but was often accompanied on his expeditions for the Smithsonian by his wife, Emma Dean Powell, and his sister, Ellen Powell Thompson, both of whom did scientific work on these expeditions, roughing it, going cross-country all around the West. And of course, their names have been completely forgotten until Candace Green brought them to our attention in the History of Anthropology review, just this summer. And lastly, I would just say that, of course, to write women into history, we need to start by reading more women. And one of my idols, I guess you could say, certainly somebody I emulate, is Harvard historian and New Yorker staff writer Jill Lepore. Her book, Book of Ages, came out in 2013, is a biography of Jenny Franklin, Benny's little sister. So Jenny Franklin was as impoverished and obscure as in her lifetime as Ben Franklin was wealthy and celebrated. And they carried on a correspondence. She didn't know how to read and write, sort of barely. but the contrast between the two siblings makes for a fascinating biography. And Lepore just pulled out all the stops to find out every little scrap that Jenny ever wrote, and it just makes for a fascinating book. It was a candidate for the National Book Award. And I just would say that that book, but all of Lepore's oeuvre is is a model for how we can bring women into history from however obscure their backgrounds might be. Everybody from the Gladys Reichards to the Jenny Franklins. And we can do that without becoming marginalized as like feminist historians. We just need to write them into the story. And so, of course, we need to learn the story first, the real facts of the story, and then write them in. And by doing that, we'll be really supporting all the women like Gladys Reichard, who really were convinced that people of all sexes, genders, races, creeds deserve to be visible to themselves and to all of the rest of us. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. And people can unmute themselves with questions right now.
This is Truly, and I had a comment that struck me very strongly, and that's that Ruth Bader Ginsburg focused very strongly on the language she used.
Yes.
That was something that was so important to her, and I think you really share that. And can you tell us about the vigil tonight?
Oh, yes, I was going to announce that. So I forgot to bring the piece of paper, but somebody correct me if I'm wrong. It's going to be in Granite Park at
Granite Creek Park.
Granite Creek Park. It starts at 5:45.
Thank you so much.
And Reverend Patty will be
Yes.
speaking. She's the only person speaking, I understand.
Yes. And typically people bring candles or electric candles or whatever. But sometimes, if you're lucky, there'll be somebody there with extras. So if you don't have something like that to bring, or if it's really windy or something, and you might be able to borrow an electric candle.
Thank you so much.
There's probably going to be around 60 candles, and definitely do not bring a real candle.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Fire danger.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. Right. It's not like there's water in the creek or anything.
No.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
I have a comment and a question, please. Can I go ahead?
Shoot.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. First, I thoroughly enjoyed the biography, so I really highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it. I found her to be a remarkable woman and a true humanist and funny. I loved that she drove around the Southwest in these cars that she named. I just really related to that. And I feel like you captured her spirit amazingly well. And I also feel like this bio could easily be a film, and it just has so much life to it. So thank you for writing it. And what strikes me lately, especially in light of Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, is how easily someone's work and legacy can be lost or even reversed, particularly women. And this biography right now, it feels like a cautionary tale of what could happen to Ruth or anyone who is trying to say something today. And so my question is, do you feel that your study of Gladys Reichard and the publication of this book has changed how the anthropology community views her? Do the people now seem more aware of her work?
Yeah, thanks, Steve, for that question and those comments. I mean, it's one of the reasons it took me so long to write this book, beside the fact that it was my first, so I had to teach myself everything and invent everything and then make all the mistakes and undo them and et cetera. It was a mess. I wish this hadn't been my first book, because I feel like now with this experience I could write a better book, but thank you for sharing that you enjoyed it anyway. But the problem I had was that, I was so, of course, because Gladys Reichard was very relevant to my existence, having been in academia for all these years. And then, our political situation and just our social situation was in such turmoil. It just seemed like she seemed so relevant, and the struggles she had and the things she overcame were so relevant and inspiring for our present moment. Since 2013 when I started the book. But in writing the book, publishers don't want a book of a certain size. If she had already been famous, I probably could have written the 2 volumes that I could have written, that I did write and had to cut. But because she was a relative unknown, I had to kind of sell her to the publisher at the same time as tell her story and appreciate her, and that was not easy, because all I could think of was all of this really damning with faint praise literature that had been written about her. So I wanted to argue with that. I wanted to push back against that. I used the example of Bill Lyon, but he was only one of several people. And Margaret Mead certainly gave me a lot of room to argue with. But I got the book out, and I'm never sure that it was going to get published, but I'm not an anthropologist, so I'm an outsider, right? And so there was the other risk that I could do all this research, but they wouldn't listen to me because I'm not one of them, right? And in fact, that's pretty much what I think is happening. So does that bother me? No, I don't feel like I had any other choice. Like, once I knew the truth and I knew the value of this person, like, I'm not really writing this book for today's working anthropologist, right? I'm writing it for the woman, 20 years from now, who is working on her PhD in anthropology and thinking, what is all this stuff? Why am I doing this? What's the point? Because at this point, academia, anthropology as an academic discipline has evolved to pattern with all the other ones, which is it's very interested in promoting itself. And it's not as, it doesn't put as much energy, at least it doesn't teach its students straight out. We're making social change. Basically, they got burned in the mid-century after the Second World War with Margaret Mead's sort of desire to socially engineer our culture and our society. And they took that and ran with it. So that it isn't until the early 2000s that anthropologists are starting to say, wait a second, no, we're really here because we're trying to lift up people who aren't heard unless we, talk about them to our fellow readers and students. So the shorter answer is that I am writing this book for posterity. I wrote the book for posterity. And I think that's kind of what history writing it's got to do. You can't expect any kind of immediate reward. I mean, it's also just a logistical thing that in terms of anthropologists through their various publication organs, various journals and stuff, it takes a year or 2 to get a book review through the pipeline. I mean, just to get it to press. And I've heard from various people, mostly strangers, fortunately, that, reviews have been written. I don't know what they are. I mean, I was told good things, but I don't know. So I'm a long ways from being able to tell if my book had any impact on that community, but I'm not in despair about that, because if I hadn't written the book, then I know what would have happened, an absolute, nothing. In fact, that her reputation could have only gone lower.
Right.
So I've kind of put a bit of a bulwark in there for posterity, and I might not even live to see it matter, but because of the pressure in academic writing to use fairly current sources, when somebody in 2040, wants to write about the era that Gladys was in her circle, they're going to be less inclined to go to something written in 1989 than something that was written in 2020, 2019, right? That's just kind of the decorum there. So eventually my version of the story will get into the mainstream, but it could take a really long time. So, if I was hoping to have an impact, an immediate impact, I've since shed any hope of that. I mean, the book is there; it exists. They can't take that away from the literature.
And in some ways, you're a lot like Gladys Reichard, a little bit of an outsider writing about another outsider. Yeah. So it sort of makes sense in the world of the sisterhood.
Yeah, it's hard to be an insider. It's really, really hard. Yeah, because usually you have to surrender, you know, a lot of
Yes.
your independence. And so there's something to be said for, you know, sort of sticking to your outsider status. And I continued to do that. I was asked to, you know, do a panel discussion at the American Anthropological Association next winter. And I've never belonged to that organization. I've never had an anthropology course. So I could have gone there and it would have promoted my book and everything. But, you know, I just said to the person, you know, I'm past that. The book is what I have to say. And the book, I hope, will stand, you know, long past, you know, any memory of me even.
You did a
Thank you.
really good job of showing the difference with the way Ruth Benedict and the way Margaret Mead, why they were accepted and she wasn't. I thought that was really fascinating and well done in there.
Oh, good. I'm not sure how much that's come through. Most discussions I've had have been mostly about, you know, her male rivals, because they did such a, you know, wipeout job on her. And of course, you know, there's kind of this doesn't seem appropriate, but there's kind of a sacred cow deal about Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict. And I actually was working with a retired Arizona anthropologist who, you know, taught at U of A for a long time and had a big reputation. And we sort of went our separate ways. She just couldn't accept that I was daring to criticize Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict's approach, you know, to anthropology. And again, I'm not an anthropologist, so I don't get to have a say
Sacred
about
cows.
the actual art of anthropology, right? But I had to, because Gladys chose a different path.
And she probably would, I mean, she was accepting of different paths.
Yes.
She just, but no one accepted her because
Right.
yeah, that was very clear.
Oh,
Like
good.
she wasn't blaming them
Yeah.
for doing what they're doing. She just wanted to do it her way.
That's right.
And they didn't like that.
That's right. That's correct. Yeah.
It's Maria Elena, and I have a question that maybe, I will admit that I have not read the book yet, and so you may have answered some of these questions in your book, but one of the first things that occurs to me is, what drew you to her? Why did you want to write about her?
Right. Well, so in a former life, I've had several careers, but in a former life, I got a PhD in North American Indian linguistics in 1995, 96, I think the graduation date was. And I had done my master's studies in a similar area. And so in that arena, you sort of pick a language, and a Native American language to study and analyze. And the one that I picked belongs to a family of languages that Gladys Reichard wrote the first grammar of. And so I used her as a source. I mean, faceless, I knew nothing about her. She was just a name on the page. And then there was this long description of the Coeur d'Alene grammar, Coeur d'Alene native grammar, which I used as, you know, reference material for my own, because it's a sister language that I wrote my dissertation on. So I just knew her that way. And of course, you know, when there were other, you know, her name popped around, but really I had no idea she'd ever studied the Navajo, for example. I mean, that's how little I knew about her.
Wow.
So when I moved from the Northwest to the Southwest, I kind of, you know, looked around, and I would hear her name in conjunction with Navajo weaving. That's pretty much it, because she wrote a book that's still quite popular called Spider Women. It's a free download if you're interested. It's a wonderful book, very, very readable, not technical at all, but extremely up to date. I mean, you wouldn't believe that it was written in 1934, you know, it's just really current. But in any case, and that's when I started to get this kind of cognitive dissonance, that like what I knew about her and what other people knew about her was, you know, there was just these big gaps and things didn't add up. And then I started reading little things, and I really, I mean, the practical side of it is I was about to go on my first sabbatical, and I really wanted to write a book. I had never written one, and I decided I wanted to. And so this person kind of just came into my life, you know. I mean, I knew her name, but I really didn't know much else. And she was just a perfect fit for me in so many ways. And then also just incredibly fun to be around. I mean, it was really a joy. The first part of the writing process was really a joy. The part where you're starting to worry about getting published or not, that's not so fun.
Follow up to that, and again, is it, by the way, the book is still available at Peregrine?
Yes. Oh,
Okay.
definitely.
Okay.
And you can get it curbside. You can go in the store now and get it.
Yeah, I've been lately.
Yeah.
Okay, but quick question. In the book, do you address how it was that she was accepted within these communities to do what she did?
Yes. And that, I mean, what I tried to do, remember this struggle of, you know, do I focus on her life or her afterlife? Well, I finally, just for sheer space reasons, I had to sort of cut out everything about the afterlife and just like hint at it, as in that those passages I read. But yeah, I mean, there was so much positive about what she did, and she was very well recognized at the time. It wasn't like she, you know, was just constantly oppressed and so. I mean, she did her own thing. I mean, nothing could stop her, and she knew that, you know, there was some friction, some pushback, but it just didn't faze her. I mean, she was just so secure in herself and so self-possessed. But oops, I lost my train of thought.
No, but I mean, you know, you do deal with the idea that,
Oh,
you know, why she was accepted.
yes, and all I can say is that, you know, when I described her personality a little bit at the beginning of my talk, she just had the perfect personality for an anthropologist. She put people at their ease. She could fit into any situation. I mean, she wasn't a chameleon. I mean, it wasn't that she was false or anything. She just was so secure in herself somehow. I mean, that's just how she was raised, how she was born, that she could just sort of, you know, saunter into any situation. She knew when to stay quiet. She knew when to speak up. She made a point of learning the language so she could call all of her Navajo acquaintances by their, you know, kind of nicknames and stuff, which are the norm. You don't call somebody by their ceremonial name. She just knew how to fit in, and she also didn't go around with a clipboard, you know, asking obnoxious questions or taking pictures without permission. She lived with these people. She befriended these people. They loved her. I mean, it was, I mean, of course there were people who were skeptical, you know, Dene who were skeptical, but she was, I don't know, she radiated trustworthiness, I think, and she knew to manage that. You know, she didn't abuse it, but at the same time, she knew how to get what she wanted, if you will, but in a very personable, very genial way. And so she was
very respectful way.
Absolutely.
And
right.
And she was
right.
genuinely interested in them and their culture.
That's right. That's right.
That
And Nancy, I got the feeling that her humanist approach to all these people that she was meeting was almost the basis of the resentment that the other anthropologists had for her, that they didn't appreciate her open style.
Well, yes and no. It was kind of the excuse, right? Because in that era, that was the great upwelling of technology, of science as this hard, you know, instrument where you could sort A from B and not be wrong. You know, there were formulas for these things. There were methodologies, there were techniques, and you were, especially in linguistics, it was really the golden age of what we call structural linguistics, which is basically a fantasy that you can reduce languages to their, you know, principal parts and a set of rules, and that if you got all those things spread out on a, you know, on a tabletop, then you could put them all together into grammar, and we would know how to, you know, we would know how a Navajo speaker thinks, you know, how they project what they think into the world as language. So it was very formulaic, very systematic kind of impulse, this aesthetic. And so, it's been referred to as a hard, a kind of a hard science, right? That linguistics was meant to be a hard science. And so her notion, oh, and by the way, it wasn't supposed to touch culture, because culture was contaminated by all kinds of touchy-feely things like emotions and traditions and habits and tastes, right? Language was supposed to be cut and dried if you got it far enough away from culture. So the very fact that she refused to entirely, she could do both methodologies, and but she could run them in parallel in her mind and on paper. And that was a reason for her, particularly male linguists, to reject her as this sort of, irrational, emotional, intuitive type, right? I mean, intuitive today is a good word. In the
Right.
1920s and 30s, when it came to science, intuition was, the kiss of death. And but she was working with real people, and she wanted to know who those real people were. And that did not fit the mold of this sort of clinical understanding of these strange people, so that we could take the best of what they did and apply it to our culture and fix our broken society. So it was very extractive, to use a word that's come up recently. Mm-hmm. And this is why I think she got along so well with Native people, is because she did not operate in a coercive or extractive manner at all, because her basic mindset was, wow, this is fascinating. Look at how people think so differently and act so differently. This is fantastic. And with that sort of in her kind of DNA, she radiated that, and people understood that, even if they were, kind of conditioned to be cautious about anthropologists. There was something when they got to know Gladys that they saw as authentic and non-threatening. And I think that was really tied to this business of why the male anthropologists really resented her and tried to sideline her as intuitive and emotional and, and womanly.
Yes.
And if you're lucky enough not to have read the book yet, you have a real treat. So don't not do that. It was just wonderful.
In what you were saying, it occurred to me that one of the things in terms of writing it, when even women are described by men in the writing, in reading about Mary Coulter, for instance, I mean,
right.
She existed at the time, more or less contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright. Everybody knows him.
Right.
Not that many people know Mary Coulter, and the books that you read about her, they always think, oh, she was difficult, or it was, yeah. And just as a final note, in terms of women being left out of history, I only have two words: Mary Magdalene.
Can you tell us what you're working on now?
Well, yes, I will try to keep it short because I get effusive about this stuff. But one of the Navajo people that Reichard got very close to was a young man born in 1911 or 12. The records aren't absolutely certain on that. So he was quite a bit younger than she. And but his name at the time was Adolph Bittany. And he was born and raised in the Wheatfields area, if you know the reservation. I know you do, Susan. But anyway, so, way out there. And he was a grandson of Chi Dodge, who everybody seems to, if anybody knows anything about Navajo society or history, they know about Chi Dodge, who was always, the epithet is always the first tribal chairman of the Navajo Nation, which isn't quite true. And he wasn't really quite the tribal chairman that people think he was. But anyway, Adolph came into Reichard's life in 1934 when she was running a Navajo literacy program, that is to say, teaching Navajo interpreters to write in Navajo so that they could write their own books and publications and to educate the people. This was not Bible translation, as so many other literacy efforts had been. And so she ends up hiring him as her linguistic assistant, field assistant, and they, proceed to bomb around the countryside, taping, recording onto these first wax cylinders and then these Presto aluminum discs, recordings of these old men, mostly chanters, medicine men, telling the legends that go with the chants. And this is something that I didn't know before, that there's this whole oral literature that sort of backs what happens in the Navajo ceremonies. And Adolph had been born and raised, probably in a hogan someplace. And so he was a fluent speaker, super smart. Unfortunately, he was educated in boarding schools. So his life got sort of messed up early. But the fact of the matter is that she really valued him. They were very close friends. He called her grandma, of course. But then World War II happened. He went away, and that was the end of his career in linguistics. He eventually became a painter in the 1950s, and he's done some beautiful work, and he had quite a reputation in Arizona. And so I decided to write a biography of him. Turns out, I discovered after the Reichard book was out that he has, I don't know, it's a huge amount, but a lot of his papers were sold to the Beinecke Rare Books Museum at Yale. And so there's an archive for Adolf Bitney, and he had changed his name to A.D. Dodge, which is one reason that I didn't know about it. And so I have this really, really rich resource, documentary resource to write his biography. And I've tried to contact his family members. I'm still not there yet, but he's an absolutely fascinating person. And the fact that he connects with Reichard and wrote about her really helps me feel, connected to the sort of the same family of events and the same family of people. And I'm really excited about it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll be looking forward to that one.
It's not going to take me 6 years this time.
No, but we met him in the Anthropologist.
Yes. Yes.
Uncommon Anthropologist.
Yes, he is in there. That's right.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any more questions or
I
comments?
I see some things in chat, but I don't have chat open. Is that?
Oh yeah, one thing is in again. Let's see.
From Becky.
Oh yes, from Becky.
Oh, wonderful.
Growing up in Prescott. Oh, do you want me to read it, or can you?
No, that's right. I was just reading it myself. Yeah, I haven't said a word about the Hubbles. She was very, very close to the whole Hubble clan. Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's fantastic. Oh.
Yeah.
So I guess, I don't know, can everybody see this? I guess if you don't have chat turned on, but.
I'd be happy to comment about it real briefly. I know time is short, but
yeah.
This is just a story that my family repeated many times, and I regret that I didn't ask my father more about his travels with Gladys Reichard. But I remember the setting at which my grandfather and Lorenzo were talking at the Prescott Rodeo. There were several Navajo women there who were weaving, and apparently cowboys like to buy Navajo saddle blankets on the rodeo during the rodeo week. So it was kind of a thing that that was going on there, which was very interesting to me. But I just wondered if you'd come across any information. I know that the convertible, and I haven't read the book yet, so it might be there, but the convertible that you mentioned earlier, what was mentioned by my dad when he would recount this story is that sometimes they had to drive a wagon with a 2-horse hitch because of sand that would get the vehicle stuck.
Yes.
And did you come across anything like that?
Absolutely. A lot of this stuff is in the Hubble family papers down at U of A, because, as I said, I hadn't said it previously, but Reichard and the Hubbles, particularly Roman and Dorothy, that generation, they were very, very close. I would say that Dorothy Hubble was Gladys's best friend in the Southwest for sure, and she stayed there all the time. I mean, for years and years and years. And she lived with the Navajo family, was just 6 miles south of Ganado. So that was her real center of operations until she moved over to Flagstaff, when the people she worked with started sort of dying off. Yes, I mean, Dorothy describes her as never going anywhere without, tire chains and shovels. And she often would, load up with all the people who needed to be going someplace. They'd have their baby lambs and the whole thing. So the car would be seriously overloaded with, people kind of hanging out the sides. But the good part about that is that they knew the landscape. So she did too, but they knew how to watch out for quicksand, because, you know, quicksand isn't wet, right? And so they would go all over the place. And if she did get stuck in something, if they all missed it and didn't see it coming, then there was lots of people to help pull the car out. And Museum of Northern Arizona has these wonderful photo albums that Gladys left there, that people put there after she died. And there's lots of pictures of her car in various states of being pulled out of creeks and whatnot with these wagons, you know. And when you say a wagon with, you know, 2-horse wagon, you know, right away a picture comes to mind that I've seen there, and who knows? I mean, that could be a picture of that very thing, you know, that very event you're talking about. So
my sister and I are looking forward very much to going up there one of these days when it's safe, but we'd love to pour through the archives and see if we can find pictures of my dad.
Yeah. Well, I had a standing appointment every month to go up there for about 3 years. And then I wrote what I hope will be eventually an issue of Plateau on the women whose papers are in the MNA archives. Unfortunately, I turned it in the very day this spring when the MNA closed for the pandemic. So it might be a couple of years, maybe it'll never happen. I don't know, but I'm very familiar with those archives, and thinking of other people like Dee and others who are interested in photography. The photography that's available up there is to die for. I mean,
it is indeed. I was fortunate to go through a collection of Earl Forrest photographs, and I put together a trading post show a few years ago. And so I happened to be working there in the reception area at the museum when the moon rocks were there, and we had a guard there all day, every day, and the guard and I got to be good friends because we both sat there like, it was those
watching
were some long days. Yeah, watching the rocks.
No, it's a great place, and right now it's closed. I just wrote just the other day to ask if the research collections are open, and they're just not. Everybody's still working from home. And who knows how long it'll be, but there's a treasure trove up there. I mean, I probably wouldn't have been as motivated to write this book if it hadn't been that, you know, 90 minutes away there's this amazing archive of Reichard stuff.
Yes. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I look forward to it. I've got it right here.
Oh, wonderful. It's in the public library too, and I have to say, little pitter patter here, the last time I checked there were 4 holds on it. So
yay.
So you don't really, you want to have it for yourself because it takes a while to process it. And was always going back and connecting things, and it's lovely. I'm not just saying that because I work at a bookstore, but this is a book I treasure to have.
Oh, that's so kind. That's really kind.
Your recommendations are always worthy. Your historical fiction mentions are always on the top of my list.
Thank you.
Sisterhood. That's good sisterhood.
Yes. Well, thank you, everyone. If we don't have any more comments, sure you don't have some last thing to say, then we'll just let her go back to her new book, because I bet you she will be doing that.
I will be, but I'm going to go to the vigil, so maybe I'll see some of you there.
Yes. Right.
Thank you, Nancy. It was very enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Bye.